When the World Bank was created after World War II, it presented itself as a moral institution. Its mission was framed as reconstruction, stability, and poverty reduction. It would lend money to developing nations to build infrastructure, strengthen institutions, and lift populations out of hardship. It would be technical, apolitical, and benevolent. That image would not survive the Cold War. By the 1960s and 1970s, a pattern began to emerge across Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia. The World Bank was approving massive loans to governments that were not democratic, not accountable, and often openly brutal. Military juntas, personalist dictatorships, and one-party authoritarian states received billions in development funding while imprisoning dissidents, censoring the press, and violently suppressing opposition. The money was not hidden. The contracts were public. What was hidden was the consequence. In country after country, World Bank loans flowed into regimes that had no mechanisms to ensure the money reached the public. Infrastructure projects became vehicles for corruption. Dams, highways, and power plants were awarded to companies linked directly to ruling families or military elites. Budgets were inflated. Oversight was minimal. Audits were weak or non-existent. The people remained poor. The debt remained. One of the earliest and most revealing examples was Zaire under Mobutu Sese Seko. Mobutu ruled for decades with near-absolute power, presiding over a kleptocratic state where corruption was not incidental but systemic. During his rule, Zaire received hundreds of millions of dollars from the World Bank and other international financial institutions. Internal assessments later acknowledged that much of this money was stolen almost immediately. Mobutu built palaces, foreign bank accounts, and a personal fortune that vastly exceeded the country's national reserves. Meanwhile, hospitals collapsed, infrastructure decayed, and public salaries went unpaid. Yet the loans continued. The justification was stability. World Bank officials argued that disengaging would harm the population more than the regime. They framed lending as a necessary evil, a way to keep fragile states from total collapse. What they did not explain publicly was that the same loans entrenched the very regimes causing the collapse. This pattern repeated elsewhere. In Indonesia, under President Suharto, the World Bank became one of the regime's largest financial supporters. Suharto's government received billions in development loans while maintaining a highly centralized system of patronage and repression. World Bank-funded projects were routinely siphoned through networks controlled by the ruling elite. World Bank insiders later admitted that corruption was institutionalized and widely understood. The lending continued anyway. In Latin America, military governments in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile received World Bank support during periods marked by disappearances, torture, and mass political repression. Loans were justified as economic modernization. Human rights were treated as externalities. The institution claimed neutrality. It insisted it did not interfere in political matters. But money is never neutral. By the late 1970s, economists inside and outside the World Bank began raising alarms. They documented how loans to authoritarian regimes increased inequality, strengthened security forces, and transferred debt burdens onto future democratic governments. These warnings were recorded, they were circulated internally, they were ignored. The bank's own research units produced studies showing that authoritarian lending correlated with higher corruption and lower development outcomes. Yet the lending departments continued approving projects at scale. Career incentives rewarded loan volume, not results. Success was measured by how much money was disbursed, not by what it achieved. When dictators fell, the consequences became visible. Newly elected democratic governments inherited enormous debts for projects that never benefited their citizens. Infrastructure was incomplete or dysfunctional. Public finances were crippled. Repayment obligations remained legally binding. The dictators were gone. The debt was permanent. By the 1980s and 1990s, this reality was no longer deniable. Civil society groups, investigative journalists, and former World Bank staff began exposing the institution's role in sustaining authoritarian regimes. They questioned why loans continued despite overwhelming evidence of abuse. The response was not accountability. It was damage control. The World Bank began reframing its past. Internal documents emphasized learning experiences rather than failures. Responsibility was shifted onto borrowing governments. Corruption was described as a local problem, not a systemic one enabled by lending practices. Files were archived, language was softened, narratives were rewritten. What had once been described internally as known corruption became externally described as unfortunate outcomes. What had been structural was reframed as accidental. And the institution moved forward without reckoning. Behind closed doors, officials acknowledged a quiet truth. The bank had not simply failed to stop dictators. It had financed them, stabilized them, and extended their lifespan. In some cases, it had outlived them. The moral authority of development lending had been compromised, but the public image remained intact. For decades, the World Bank presented itself as a force for good while burying the record of who it had empowered and why. The cover-up was not a single act. It was a slow erasure, and the full cost would only become clear much later. By the early 1990s, the evidence inside the World Bank had become impossible to ignore. The institution had accumulated decades of internal evaluations, confidential audits, and field reports documenting how its loans had strengthened authoritarian rule instead of reducing poverty. These were not fringe opinions. They were written by the bank's own economists, project managers, and compliance officers. What changed was not the knowledge. What changed was the response. Rather than confronting the consequences publicly, the World Bank began to reorganize how information moved inside the institution. Reports that once circulated broadly were now restricted. Language that explicitly referenced corruption or political repression was replaced with neutral technical phrasing. Failures were reframed as implementation challenges. Responsibility was dispersed until it belonged to no one. This shift coincided with a larger transformation. As the Cold War ended, the World Bank positioned itself as the central authority on global development. Its credibility became its most valuable asset. Admitting that it had financed dictators knowingly would undermine its legitimacy at a moment when its influence was expanding. So the narrative was managed. One of the clearest fault lines appeared around the issue of debt. Countries emerging from dictatorship were still required to repay loans taken out by unelected regimes. These debts were legally binding, even when the funds had been stolen or misused. The World Bank maintained that debt obligations were separate from political legitimacy. This position protected the institution financially, but it transferred the burden of authoritarian corruption directly onto civilian populations. In country after country, newly elected governments faced impossible choices. Servicing debt meant cutting health care, education, and social programs. Defaulting meant economic isolation. The dictators had disappeared, but their financial legacy remained embedded in international contracts enforced by institutions that claimed moral neutrality. Inside the bank, some staff objected. They argued that loans made to regimes with no accountability mechanisms violated the institution's stated mission. They warned that continuing to enforce repayment entrenched poverty rather than alleviating it. They questioned how development could occur when money was systematically diverted to elites. These objections were documented. They were filed. They were sidelined. Career advancement within the bank depended heavily on loan approval and disbursement. Staff who raised concerns about governance or human rights found themselves excluded from key projects. Promotions favored those who delivered funding, not those who questioned its impact. The system rewarded compliance. At the same time, the World Bank refined its public messaging. Press releases emphasized success stories. Statistical improvements were highlighted without context. Aggregate growth figures were presented as proof of progress, even when wealth was concentrated among a narrow ruling class. Poverty was measured narrowly. Corruption was externalized. Responsibility was abstracted. When critics accused the bank of enabling repression, the institution responded with procedural defenses. It claimed it did not interfere in political affairs. It argued that sovereignty prevented it from judging how governments used funds. It insisted that disengagement would worsen outcomes. This argument ignored a central reality. Lending was itself a political act. Money stabilized regimes. It funded security apparatuses indirectly by freeing domestic resources. It signaled international legitimacy. It extended the lifespan of governments that might otherwise have collapsed under economic pressure. By continuing to lend, the World Bank was not neutral. It was decisive. In the mid-1990s, external pressure intensified. Investigative journalists obtained leaked documents showing that senior officials were aware of large-scale corruption at the time loans were approved. Academic studies traced direct links between World Bank funding and elite enrichment in authoritarian states. The institution responded with reform language. New policies were announced. Anti-corruption units were created. Governance indicators were introduced. Public commitments to transparency were made. On paper, the bank appeared to be transforming. In practice, little changed. Loans continued to flow to governments with poor human rights records. Oversight mechanisms lacked enforcement power. Sanctions were rare. Projects were rebranded rather than restructured. The fundamental incentive structure remained intact. The reforms protected the image of accountability, without threatening the system that produced the failures. When whistleblowers spoke publicly, the response was swift and quiet. Their credibility was questioned. Their contracts were not renewed. Their warnings were treated as isolated grievances rather than systemic critiques. The message was clear: dissent would not change policy. By the early 2000s, the World Bank had successfully repositioned itself. The past was no longer discussed in terms of complicity, but as a learning phase. Institutional memory was diluted by staff turnover. Archived documents became difficult to access. Public discourse focused on future goals rather than historical responsibility. The dictatorships of the Cold War era were reframed as distant anomalies, disconnected from present practice. Yet the debt remained. The inequality remained. The development failures remained. The World Bank had not simply survived the exposure. It had absorbed it, neutralized it, and moved forward without consequence. The cover-up was not absolute secrecy. It was selective visibility. Enough transparency to appear accountable. Enough opacity to avoid reckoning. And beneath the polished language of development economics, the same unresolved question persisted, unanswered, unacknowledged, and deliberately avoided. Who was the World Bank really accountable to? And who paid the price for that answer? By the time the 21st century arrived, the World Bank's role in funding authoritarian regimes had largely vanished from public debate. The institution had succeeded in reframing its past as a necessary imperfection of a more primitive era. Official narratives emphasized reform, transparency, and lessons learned. What remained unexamined was how deeply the consequences of that past were still shaping the present. The most enduring legacy was debt. Across Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, nations continued to repay loans taken out by dictators decades earlier. These debts were not theoretical. They consumed national budgets, dictated austerity measures, and limited the policy choices of democratic governments that had never consented to the original agreements. The money borrowed in the name of development had often vanished into offshore accounts, but the obligation to repay it had not. This imbalance was not accidental. International financial law prioritized creditor rights over political legitimacy. The World Bank and its partners maintained that continuity of repayment was essential to global stability. To challenge that principle would risk unraveling the system itself. So the system was protected. Attempts to argue that such debts were illegitimate were quietly sidelined. The concept of odious debt, which holds that populations should not be responsible for loans taken by oppressive regimes, gained academic attention but no institutional enforcement. Acknowledging it would mean admitting complicity and potentially forfeiting billions. The result was a silent transfer of wealth from post-dictatorship societies to international creditors. At the same time, the bank's internal culture had evolved to prevent a repeat of public scandal. Oversight existed, but it was procedural rather than moral. Corruption was measured statistically, not structurally. Human rights concerns were acknowledged rhetorically but treated as secondary to macroeconomic stability. Authoritarian governments learned how to adapt. Rather than ruling openly through repression, many regimes adopted the language of reform while preserving centralized power. Elections were staged. Anti-corruption commissions were created without authority. Development plans were drafted to satisfy donor expectations while control remained unchanged. The World Bank continued lending. The justification had shifted, but the outcome was familiar. Money flowed to governments that could manage appearances. Projects were approved based on formal compliance rather than lived reality. Local elites captured benefits. Civil society absorbed costs. The institution had learned how to avoid blame without changing behavior. In the years following the global financial crisis, the bank expanded its reach once again. Emergency lending increased. Fast-track approvals reduced scrutiny. The need for rapid intervention was emphasized. Once more, urgency replaced accountability. Patterns reemerged. Loans strengthened executive power during moments of instability. Security forces expanded under the guise of state capacity. Surveillance infrastructure was funded as modernization. Civil liberties deteriorated quietly, without triggering institutional alarms. The World Bank did not cause these outcomes alone, but it enabled them just as it had before. Former officials later acknowledged that political considerations had never truly disappeared. They had simply become implicit rather than explicit. Strategic interests were no longer discussed openly, but they influenced where money flowed and where it did not. Some countries received patience. Others received pressure. The difference was rarely explained. Public-facing transparency improved, but access to meaningful accountability did not. Reports were published, but consequences were rare. Failures were documented, but responsibility remained diffuse. The institution had mastered a crucial skill, surviving criticism without absorbing blame. For populations living under governments supported by international financing, the reality was unchanged. Development projects came and went. Consultants rotated in and out. Promises were renewed. Poverty persisted. Repression adapted. The original mission of the World Bank, to reduce poverty, had not failed universally. But where it intersected with authoritarian power, it had often reinforced the very structures it claimed to dismantle. And the historical record showed that this was not ignorance. It was choice. The cover-up was not a single moment of deception. It was a long process of normalization. Each loan justified in isolation. Each failure framed as exception. Each warning absorbed and neutralized. By the time the pattern was undeniable, It had become invisible. Today, the institution speaks fluently about inclusion, sustainability, and governance. Yet the question of accountability for past harm remains unresolved. No formal reckoning has occurred. No debts have been forgiven on the basis of dictatorship. No institutional responsibility has been acknowledged at scale. The dictators are remembered. The loans are not. And that absence is the final concealment. Because history did not end when the regimes fell. It continued in balance sheets, repayment schedules, and development plans constrained by decisions made decades earlier, in rooms where consequences were understood but deferred. The World Bank did not merely witness authoritarianism. It financed it. It stabilized it. And when the cost became undeniable, it learned how to look forward without looking back. The cover-up was successful not because the truth was hidden, but because it was allowed to fade, buried beneath language, procedures, and the quiet assumption that development absolves all sins. But the debt remains, and so does the record. Whether it will ever be confronted is no longer a question of evidence, only of will.